So thank you everyone for joining NEDEC's webinar on a facilitated discussion on religious and spiritual fasting. My name is Ari Maharaj. I'm NEDEC's Outreach and Education Coordinator, and I use he, him pronouns. We're joined today by Joy, Aaron, and Malak, and I'm so excited for this conversation. It's been so long in the planning of it, and I'm really excited, I think, for a conversation that will also meet the values of something called cultural humility, where we're all going to be here in the space, willing to learn from each other. And I want you to know in advance from me, and I'll let the panelists do this themselves too, that disclosures and acknowledgements that we want to make. And for myself, I'm only going to be speaking from my experience, and I'm going to ask for the panelists to do that on this topic too. I think especially when we're having conversations that involve underserved communities or conversations that necessarily haven't been in the mainstream of eating disorder conversation. Sometimes there's a tendency to want to speak for everything because there's such a lack of these conversations. And all of us in our prep are going to make sure that we're being mindful of that nuance in a way that feels true to us. So without further ado, I'll let Joy, Aaron, and Malak say a little bit about themselves, tell you who they are, and make any acknowledgements that they want to make. Whichever one of you want to go.
Joy, go first.
Thank you. I think we're all
do a good job going first.
Not wanting to talk over each other, but you know, I for those of you guys who don't know me, I am Joy Ssebikindu. I am a licensed professional counselor based in Atlanta, Georgia, where I've done the majority of my career, specializing in working in eating disorders as well as other things. Have worked all levels of care, and even now still work in private practice. I work as a treatment placement specialist and consult with several treatment centers around the country, and I'm excited to expand into Canada with whatever is needed. And I love, Ari, this opportunity to really have some honest conversation. I've presented with Malak before, and Aaron and I have had some background as well, having worked for the same company at one point. These are hard conversations, and I feel like as we're preparing for these conversations around topics of diversity, golly, I never feel qualified to be able to speak. Every time, you know, I speak or I'm with a group of people, I feel like I learned so much about what I feel like I have devoted so many years kind of learning about. And there's so many nuances, and I love that term cultural humility, and I want to push us in this conversation a little bit further than just the word. What does it mean to kind of have that posture? What does it mean to actually be someone who just learns and recognizes that this is a lifelong process that I am excited and open to? And so I do identify as being Christian, and I'm excited to kind of speak on this. My only kind of qualifications of the faith, and I don't know if my dad is on here, but he is a reverend who just retired, a pastor, and so I'm a pastor's kid. And so I'm sure he's going to be correcting me if I say something wrong in the chat feature. But I'm excited to be here today, and thank you so much for the invitation.
It's awesome to have you. Thank you, Joy. Malak and Aaron.
Well, I can go next. So my name is Malak Saddy. I'm a registered dietitian and eating disorder specialist. I am based out of Dallas, Texas, but I do want to shout out to all of my Canadian family, because I was actually born in Toronto. I'm a first-generation Lebanese Muslim Canadian American, and when my dad immigrated actually to Toronto, and my mom came to the States. So that's where I have kind of the multiple backgrounds. And so when Ari reached out to me, I was so excited to be doing something for my hometown. So let's see. So as a dietitian, yeah, I am here. I have my own private practice, and I am speaking in regards to my Muslim faith and how I grew up. So I think culture and religion are so important to be talked about. And as Joy said, like, I think it's such a crucial time to be coming at it from a place of curiosity. And I love having these conversations to help like share what my experience has been, and share it with others. So I'm super pumped to be here and to chat with you guys.
Thanks, Malak. We're super happy to have you. Last but not least, Mr. Aaron Flores.
Yeah, my name's Aaron. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm a registered dietitian also. I am based out of the LA area, and I have a private practice, as well as working for Center for Discovery as their senior coordinator for weight inclusive care. I also have a podcast called Dietitians Unplugged, and I'm a certified body trust provider. Some of the, I mean, the identities I bring to this are, you know, I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I have a biracial. My father's from Mexico, my mom is from the United States, and I'm white passing. I identify as fat. I'm Jewish, and just very similar to Joy, like my Jewish sort of expertise is really thankful to I married a Jewish educator, and my partner is runs a Jewish summer camp. She has a master's in Jewish education and nonprofit management, and so a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I'm thankful for her to provide me with a lot of information. And that cultural humility part is, you know, we're sort of there's so many different ways to look at some of the stuff that each of us are going to talk about, that we're not, you know, I'm not speaking for all Jews. I'm speaking for what I know, and what some of the, you know, research I did around this, and my partner helping me, and just like Joy and Malak said, I love conversations. I could sit in conversation with people for hours. I think it's what brings us together. I think it's what sort of, when we feel divided, when we feel like disconnected, I feel like looking someone in the eye, being able to hear their lived experience and come to that with a lot of openness is how we build that human connection. And I think that's something that's really needed in the eating disorder community. It's something needed in our world in a lot of respects. So I'm just thankful to be here and to listen.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. I think we're so excited to be privy, and I'm so honored to facilitate this conversation. I wonder if a really broad place to start, just to really get us warmed up and to allow us to add some nuance to the conversation, is for folks to share what their perspective is on the differences, if there even are, and what are they, between a religious fast and a spiritual fast, and especially all of your varying intersections with your different religious denominations that we're talking about, and the different purposes of fasting in those different faiths, for whoever wants to start.
I can start. I mean, so and obviously Joy and Aaron, please jump in with your feedback and stuff too. But the way that I kind of, when we were talking about like what the difference would be between religious and spiritual, is I felt that religious was more of what is required from us as Muslims, and spiritual is maybe what the Hadith has said and is preferred. And so the Quran is it's like our Bible or the Torah. So this is our book as Muslims. And the Hadith is like the Prophet's, like the preferences of the way of life. And so the differences between the two would be, I think that Ramadan is like required by us as Muslims, whereas like coming up this week for our Eid, for our holiday, it's more recommended versus required. So that's kind of how I interpreted it. And there's different times when it's required versus preferred. So I think the only other thing with the spirituality or the fastings would be like, if maybe sometimes if I felt like out of connection with my faith, that it is something that I might do to reconnect with it as well. So, you know, do you guys have any, how'd I do?
From my perspective, you did awesome.
Well, and it's so hard because I can imagine that, you know, although we identify differently in our respective faiths, you know, religion and spirituality is so important to define because there's so many nuances depending on the lens in which you are kind of looking through. And I think for me, you know, when I hear those terms, I think of religion as being more of a man-defined practice, as opposed to like spirituality being the connection between you and your respective higher power. And for me, that's God. And so when it comes to this concept of what do we do to manifest our faith, spirituality is kind of the avenue that we use, at least for me. I hope that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would agree. You know, I think thinking of it, I think I also tend to think of it as what is like the modern application in many ways of how do I feel connected to my faith, because some of the most fulfilling discussions I've had around this is questioning. Is like, why are we doing this? Like, why you know, what is I understand it's sort of like we're being asked to do this, or you're being commanded to do this, right? Because of the religion or because of the day or the holiday, whatever it is. But why? Like, what is the actual sort of meaning, and how do we get meaning from it? So I love that distinction. And, you know, in doing this, I think one example that comes up is in Judaism, there is a fasting holiday next week also. And there's a few of them that sort of commemorate the temple. And I'm going to mess this up. I'm not going to get it right. So to all of my friends who are online who know infinitely more than me about the Torah and the Talmud, just bear with me. I'm going to get it. Oh, I'm doing C-level work. I'm going to get it pretty close. You know, we're sort of celebrating or honoring this coming holiday, the destruction of the temple in Judea. And the part of the Talmud, which is very similar to Malak, right? We have the Old Testament, the Torah, which is the sort of scripture, and then the interpretation, right, by rabbis, which is what you do, right? Is that destruction was related to this idea that there was like I forget the word, and all my friends are going to correct me, but like sort of like this growing hatred among folks, right? And the burning of the temple was almost like as a punishment, right? Because of this hatred. And so many folks are taking that modern interpretation right now, right, to say, what do we see in this world today around hatred, around lack of you know, around discrimination, around oppression, and sort of seeing that in a modern day world. And why is that fast meaningful now? And if not a fast, what brings that spirituality in to honor that same experience that we're seeing actually like living with us, especially in the past 4 months, 3 months?
I think you said it like so. It's such a good way to conceptualize it. And I think too, like even with all of that being said, we like I think the importance of separating culture from religion is really going to be important in this conversation. And the way that we each grew up is going to be different. So I think it is important to separate them. I feel like when I was younger, I felt like everything just kind of came together, and it was like, well, what is my religion telling me, and what is my family traditions, or what is my culture telling me? And so, you know, kind of like you said, the experience that we've each experienced is going to be so different as a Lebanese Muslim versus, you know, a Pakistani Muslim or a Moroccan Muslim or anything like that.
We had a comment in the chat that I think actually feeds really well into the discussion, and I'm wondering if folks feel comfortable speaking to it. But there's someone who said, although I would still consider myself to have Catholic beliefs, currently I am a non-practicing Catholic. However, I can remember during the school age of giving up foods during Lent as a way of related feeling the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. They also say love hearing the multiple experiences with religion in this conversation. But I'm wondering, and not that Joy, you have to use Lent as an example because that's what's in here, but I'm wondering how panelists are relating to that sort of experience of the giving up of food sometimes related to the feeling of sacrifices that were made for something higher.
Absolutely. Well, and I love that, you know, and again, I don't know how much of my family is in here, but I can speak to my experience, and I wonder if this would relate to the person who made that comment. But someone like me who grew up in a home that had an established religion. So I was born into ministry, as I like to say sometimes. And so I grew up going to services. I grew up going to Bible camp. I grew up just doing the practice. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I really kind of hit this moment of, gosh, like in my faith, like, why do I do this? Why do I believe? And it really was a spiritual experience for me because I couldn't necessarily rely on my family to tell me why I believe and find meaning for myself. And I do find that as I have more and more conversations with people from various religions, that is oftentimes the process that we go to. And so instead of foreclosing on this idea that, gosh, this is what I'm supposed to do, the hope is that we evolve to a place where, like, gosh, like I do this because I want to, and this is the value that I get out of that. And so when we talk about fasting, at least in the Christian faith, some of that is being able to really connect and deepen our relationship with God. There's so many different denominations within the Christian faith, and they all have their own practice. And I think when we were kind of chatting about this, it was just kind of like, depending on how you identify, will determine the practices that you do. It's not as cookie cutter and straightforward as here are the 5 tenets, here's what you do to kind of be a perfect Christian. And so we have to look deeper. We have to ask people individually, gosh, like, what does this mean for you? And it was definitely an experience that I had to, gosh, embark on.
You know, I would also like to add that, like, that Catholic idea of Lent and giving up something in honor of someone, you know, someone's sacrifice, Jesus' sacrifice, is, you know, in sort of asking, why do Jews fast, right? Almost all of them are around some sort of similar idea, right? It's to honor some event that was hard, like, you know, so we do it for Yom Kippur, where we're atoning for sins, right, as a form of restriction. You know, we're doing it around these destructions of the temple to sort of signify sort of the mourning, right, or the loss there. I learned a new word for this webinar, asceticism. I didn't know. Is you know, Jews don't fast for asceticism, for the holiness of it, right, or to say, like, I'm to get to that divine or closer to God, right? It is about sort of like withholding or in some way to sort of honor the day, or to allow for some deeper meaning. And I find that really interesting.
I think one of the cool things, like, kind of echoing with like growing up into a religion. I mean, you know, as we came here, my mom would teach me Arabic on Sundays, and my dad would teach me religion for 2 to 3 hours. And it was kind of, it was a non-negotiable, like it was just something that we did. And I'm so grateful for it now. But I remember being a kid, and during Ramadan in elementary school, and we moved a lot as kids. But fasting and not wanting to sit in the lunchroom and going to the library, so I, you know, didn't have to watch everybody fast, or everybody eating. But that was such a, like, I think a moment for me to recognize, okay, I might be a little bit different. Not only is my religious practice different, my name, my hair, all these like different things that kind of made me unique. And then of course my mom, just to make it a little bit more awkward, would always give me hummus sandwiches, and it was like full of like garlic. So anytime it was like, hey, let's make sure Malak is the awkward kid at the lunch table. But it was just something that we did. And I remember the first time as an 8-year-old when I fasted for the whole day, like our gifts kind of got bigger, you know, when we fasted for the entire day rather than half days. And so it was really exciting. And then as I felt like I grew up, asking myself, why am I doing this? I'm not getting that, you know, porcelain doll, those things anymore. And what does it mean to me? But I think the really cool thing is that I've gotten to do it in a way that fits my life, that my lifestyle and where I am right now, and incorporating those beliefs that I grew up with, also with some different things, like maybe not necessarily always fasting from food, but fasting from social media, or giving up certain things that help connect me still to my faith and beliefs.
I'm wondering, yeah, I'm almost seeing, especially over the last decade when we're out giving public education and such, that we're also hearing about this fasting that seems very disconnected from this religious and spiritual purpose, like whether it's intermittent fasting and that practice of that, whether it's it's almost like the trendy, fasting has become a trendy word. And I remember even reading some studies, especially for male identified folks, on how dieting isn't a word that they relate to, but they fast or they biohack or whatever it might be. And I'm wondering, for you three, having experience both with the clinical work in eating disorders and also now this kind of religious background that you all bring to this too, and spiritual background, what you think about the societal conversation that you are seeing around fasting now and how it relates to that experience.
I'll let the dietitian start, because you guys were squirming as Ari was describing that trend.
Well, I think, you know, it is really frustrating hearing it, because there is so much more to fasting than weight loss. But it's unfortunate, because I think anytime I talk about Ramadan and the fact that we go 30 days from sunrise to sunset without eating or drinking, everybody's first thing is like, oh, well, how much weight do you lose? Or, oh, like, isn't that awesome? You know, and praising it. And I was like, wait a second. Like, it is honestly a little bit insulting, because that's not what I'm doing this for. And it becomes so focused around weight and food, and moving away from that meaning, and it can really become unfortunate. And so, you know, I was sharing this experience earlier, but my mom had gone to a doctor, and anyways, they recommended her seeing a dietitian, even though I get it, her daughter is a dietitian. They wanted her to see, so she went. And she went actually during Ramadan when we were fasting, and she had told her that, you know, she's fasting from sunrise to sunset, and she couldn't eat. And so the response from the dietitian was like, oh, well, can't you just change your times? Can't you just change when you fast? And the tone of it was what made it so like harsh, like, and it felt kind of like icky. You know, it's not something that I am, you know, just calling up God to be like, hey, can we switch these times around for Mike? So it just felt, so I think it's helpful just to be aware of, is when you're, you know, talking to people, to be coming at it from curiosity rather than, you know, just telling us, hey, why don't you just conveniently switch the times around, because that's better for your health. And we all know that fasting and restricting is not a helpful, well, sorry, I should say, like, restricting is not a helpful thing in eating disorder recovery. And when you're fasting, are you fasting because of your religion and your connection to God, or are you fasting because it's what your eating disorder wants you to do?
I see. I mean, I agree so much of what you said, Malak. You know, when I see this, I just notice how insidious diet culture is. In even preparing to do this webinar, you know, and I'm telling some people, oh, I'm doing a webinar on religion and fasting. And they're like, oh, what do you think of intermittent fasting? That was the immediate, like, sort of question right after. And, you know, it's really interesting, because I think this is one of those ways in which, so, well, I'm going to back up. I see a lot of diet culture based in patriarchal systems, based a lot in white supremacy, a lot in sort of like this idea of being, you know, that focuses on bodies being one size fits all, and it's probably a white female body. And I see so much, like, in some ways, appropriation of where some folks, and especially indigenous folks, might get meaning from a fast, right? And sort of appropriating that for like our own journey, right? When it's not what we're indigenous to. So I see that. And then I also see like this trend, right? Like this biohacking thing, like of and I think it's really frustrating, right? Because I think we're boiling something that can be very meaningful for folks, can be very meaningful in a way where it's almost like I don't even want to like share too much about it, because like it's that close to me, and don't change it. It's that close to me. We're taking that and boiling it down into a simple 4-day plan without any of the meaning. And like Malak said, I think there's a lot of professionals who don't come at this with some cultural humility. I mean, our profession is mostly thin white women also, and not very diverse. So to bring this culture of humility to work with our clients is really important. So you know, I see it from both of those ends, right? And I just see so much influence from diet culture.
And
Thank you. Oh,
sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing, because I think it was, and if we look at the meaning of fasting, if we look at like why we fast, it is because it is a connection to God. It is to atone for our sins. It is something that is different and not normal than what we typically do. And so when we have an eating disorder and we're engaging in the fasting, we're doing the same thing, you're still continuing the same behavior. And honestly, the purpose of fasting in I think in both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is that it's uncomfortable, you know, and when you're engaging in restrictive behaviors, that's comfort. So restricting and calling it fasting is, I think we really have to separate those two, and look at it in that sense. Like, what is it meaning for you?
That's a great point.
yeah. Well, and you almost took the words just right out of my mouth, Malak. I love working with you because I think that, you know, eating disorder treatment is best done in a multidisciplinary team. And that doesn't necessarily just mean that you have the physician, the psychiatrist, the dietitian, and the therapist. Sometimes we're bringing other parties into that to truly understand this client, to be able to treatment plan. I remember it was maybe a year or two ago, I called Malak, and I was, you know, director at a treatment center. And I was like, my mind was blown trying to manage the milieu, because I had someone who identified as Muslim, I had a Hispanic, I had an African American and I think at that time, probably like 3 white people who all had diverse backgrounds, and they all ate so differently. And then we kind of came up on some religious holidays, and what did that mean? Because our standard across eating disorder treatment it's very whitewashed. And so we have those things that my clinicians and my techs at the time questioned. It was like, hey, we serve food at a certain temperature. We allow certain things at the table. And we kind of had these hard and fast rules that just no longer served our milieu because of the diversity that was at the table. I was like, Malak, what am I doing? We're almost essentially cooking multiple meals to accommodate the needs of the people, but I felt really strongly about doing that because at the end of the day, when they leave our treatment center, they're all going home. And if we are not supporting them in that integration back into their communities, I think we are not doing treatment correctly. And I think when we kind of work as a team, we're able to dig a little bit deeper to find that meeting. We did have clients at the time who were relying on their religiosity, as a way of restriction, but they were so stuck in their eating disorder brain that they had lost the spiritual connection. And so that was my work as the therapist, to really work with the family to decide what was most important in this season, given where this client was, because she couldn't connect spiritually. Her fasting was purely motivated by her eating disorder. And dare I say, it was very convenient to say, hey, I'm fasting, my family's fasting, therefore I'm not going to eat. Mm-hmm. And that was really tough.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, and I'm seeing some bits in the chat on this too, and I know it's a topic that's going to come up in the sense of, for folks with lived experience who are in treatment or navigating treatment and are having the struggle of being trying to navigate what fasting should look like for that religious purpose, whether it's Ramadan, whether it's another kind of fasting holiday. Sometimes there are experiences, and some folks have shared in the chat, of not being allowed to fast for the holiday from treatment. And then there's some folks who are really navigating that on their own, right? With their mishmash of community-based services or with their private therapist or dietitian, and they're really trying to navigate that. For the three of you, just speaking to that person with lived experience in that view first, and then I think we'll open it up to like the systemic discussion, because I think we have to balance the individual and the systemic here. But let's start with just the individual. Thoughts around navigating that for individuals who are struggling with that and their own navigation of wanting and needing to do that from a religious, spiritual lens, but also know that their health is something that is important, and fasting and the restriction that comes with fasting might not be the best thing.
So I feel, when I first meet with a client, one of the first questions I ask them is it okay if I use words of endearment like love and babe and sweetie, because I use those a lot. And the second one usually is, what is your spirituality? Do you want to incorporate it into treatment? Because I think spirituality can be such a positive and connecting aspect into recovery, and I think it can be extremely important to recognize it and not shame it or put it away. And growing up as a Muslim, especially during September, like 9/11, I was so scared to say that I'm Muslim and I don't know how to reconnect with my faith and I need help, but I don't want to identify, like, what do I do, So I do think it's important for us as clinicians to acknowledge that and to ask our clients what they feel comfortable with. And then the other aspect too becomes is that, at least for us in the Quran, there's so many other things that you can do other than fasting that still can connect you to your practices and your faith. Ramadan is a very holy month where we reconnect with prayers and reading the Quran. And so instead of fasting, you can do extra prayers or read the Quran or go help at a food bank or donate money to a charity or get off of social media. There's so many other things that we can still do that connect us with our faith and our religion. And then the next part is finding maybe a community member or like a rabbi or a priest or an imam that we can kind of talk to on it and to help kind of connect that, because sometimes I find that the client is okay with not fasting, but the parents aren't. And so how do we help like address it as a whole, and bringing in, a religious person can be helpful in creating those conversations and easing what that would look like. So, and it's not like I'm not a bad Muslim if I don't fast. I'm not a bad person if I don't engage in these things. I might be just doing it a little bit differently.
Thanks for sharing, Malak. And there's definitely some folks in the chat who are resonating with that, for sure. Aaron?
Yeah, there's a lot of great, I know on Instagram of like imams and stuff that even talk about anxiety and things like that. So I don't know, maybe I can share it later or something on the chat, but yeah.
And after the webinar, if there are resources and things, when I'm sending out the recording for folks, I'm more than happy to.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'll let you know then.
Thanks. Aaron, Joy?
Well, I think that there's such an importance just in the time that we're in. I think there is acknowledgement that eating disorders affects all people, regardless of race, religion, social economic status. And for those of us in the community, I know we see those statistics a lot. But let's look at the face of treatment. Eating disorder treatment is historically very expensive. It's not very accessible. And so when we look at the demographic of people who are actually seeking treatment versus the people who might be affected, it's pretty jarring. And so I do think that there is a call for us as clinicians to begin educating ourselves and diversifying our staff. Malak and I were at a conference, and I think we presented to about 500, 600 people. And there was a moment before we began presenting, I looked around and I was like, golly, I am the only Black person here. And we were giving a presentation on diversity. And I think I just like had this moment of like, okay, I think it's important for us to recognize that yes, these populations are impacted, but I really want to support additional training to communities that historically haven't gravitated towards eating disorder treatment as their specialties that probably need to, because representation matters. And so being able to form your community where I'm able to call Malak or Aaron and be like, hey, I have this client that I don't have much experience with, but I think that there's something here that I need to be paying attention to. Can we consult? There's such a great importance in being able to work as a team, especially as the presentation of eating disorders is changing.
When I think of, fasting in the lived experience of the individual, one of the things that often sort of comes up, or that I like to bring up is, what you do this year, right, is not forever. And, if this is the choice for your recovery, right, is that's okay. Right. And it doesn't make you a bad person, just like Malak said, right? This is just what we need to do this year, or maybe what is best for you this year. And there's going to be many other fasts down the road that you can participate in and that you can get meaning from. And I think being able to, again, do that C-level work, right? You don't need to get an A in this, just like do middle ground work, and that's really okay. I will disclose, I don't fast anymore, for sort of a lot of these reasons, because it wasn't bringing meaning. The affliction was more triggering than helpful. So just like sort of Malak said, I find other ways to honor that experience, but I don't fast, because that's what is it's not meaningful for me. So I'm going to find my own meaning in it, and I'm comfortable with that. I also, just to bring in, like, again, just some sort of background, like, sort of logistical background. I don't know what the phrase is, but there's this clause that's sort of like, you can break any Jewish law to save a life. So whether it's kashrut, right, keeping kosher, or fasting on a holiday, right, you can break any Jewish law to save a life. And depending on someone's observance level, right, they might need a rabbi's permission from that. And what I've really appreciated is sometimes you reach out to those rabbis and they're like, oh yeah, I'll set up a separate room for them. They can go eat during, so they're sort of, no one knows they're eating, right? But I'll let a friend go with them so that they can have some support. And other times, it can be frustrating, but the rabbi's like, no, they still need to fast. And that's hard. That's a hard conversation too, because, it's sort of like, well, here's my expertise and here's their expertise. And sometimes that cultural humility does not meet, right? Like sometimes folks are like, no, I think that they should still fast. And that's a hard conversation as well. It's all just so nuanced. And I think, the more we think about diversity, the more we think about listening to lived experiences and not attributing them to someone's eating disorder, or that they're being manipulative in some way, right? I think the more real like connection we build with our clients, and the more healing work we do.
Speaking to listening from lived experience, there was someone in the chat who was sharing that for them, Lent was about giving up something that was traditionally relied on too much or pleasurable in order to remove that distraction or refocus our attention back to God. And it didn't have to be a removal or restriction of food, but it could be other things as well, right? Television, other enjoyable activities. But it was primarily food. And it's hard when societally sometimes we have that idea when that gets lumped in with the food is bad because it's pleasurable and indulgent, and the labeling even of good food, bad food, of that coming up. And yeah, I love the conversation that we're having, both on the individual level of that being really hard and affirming that, and connecting kind of what Aaron and Malak were saying to Joy's larger comments systemically about this shouldn't just be on the individual. And if there was a capable, diverse, like, treatment team who was able to listen and affirm, that might allow these sorts of discussions that we need to have as individuals and with our support networks and our families to be a little bit easier, and with our religious and spiritual leaders as well. There was another person in the chat who was saying how this person is Jewish and fast is coming up, and it's challenging when the whole family is fasting and the daughter that we're supporting isn't fasting. And we don't want her to because of her anorexia diagnosis, but she would love to because of her eating disorder. And that balance can be tense and difficult to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that speaks to how food, eating disorders, all of these things ripple into not just the individual, right, but the family system, and beyond, right, the community that we recover into. And I think there's so much interest, like, I think taking this discussion night and then thinking about how it applies to the whole family system, I think is really, really interesting. Because, again, it's like, what is, it's a great question. Like, what is good for all of us, right? Like, we are all together in this, and how do we best support our loved one, but also how do we acknowledge the struggle, right? And also meet that spirituality. They're really hard conversations. And I think the more treatment teams are like comfortable with sitting in them, to what Joy spoke of, I think, the more valuable we become in their healing.
Absolutely. Just kind of hearing your comment, Ari, and Aaron, your follow-up as a treatment team member who oftentimes sits with families, because as much as we treat individuals, we're not doing life alone. So it's so important to kind of get into this dance and being able to figure out, how do we hold both of those pieces together? And that might take some brainstorming. That might take having some really difficult conversations that we don't really have the answers. I think all of us who treat eating disorders could probably confidently say this. I don't think I've treated the same person twice.
Absolutely.
And so you might have one family that identifies as being Jewish, who have different traditions and different values, and really, having to work with them at a level that might be different than the next family that you work with. There might be some flexibility with this family that, they're able to kind of meet the needs of both the individual that's suffering and the family that's trying to support them. And so I think from a clinical standpoint, being willing to have those conversations afresh every time we're sitting with someone individually and every time we're sitting with a family is really important.
And the way that I believe in all of the religions, like, God is someone who is forgiving, who is merciful, who is someone who is there for you. And so not fasting, he understands it's not something that, again, we're not doing it wrong or bad. And so I find it kind of contradictory when people would say, like, okay, well, if I didn't fast, then it's not right. But our God is somebody who knows that, who knows me, and my relationship with him is all that matters. And if I'm not fasting because of my eating disorder, then I know that he is forgiving and merciful and understands. So I think you can even look at it from that perspective too, that it's not something taboo or wrong to do.
I'm wondering, and it's another thing I'll shout out from the chat is we have clergy folks attending, and they've said that they think that other clergy and religious leaders would benefit from basic education on eating disorders and how some spiritual teachings reinforce or even strengthen those disorders. I'm wondering if we can use that comment as a launching point for the panel to kind of talk about if you have a platform right now to share nuances with other providers in the most inclusive sense for what a provider is, right? Not just people with our degree and credentials and as wide as we can have it. What were some thoughts or nuances that you'd love them to share to take away from this conversation?
There's so many.
I know.
Always
like
part of a really big question like that, but
yeah.
I appreciate you thinking about it.
I don't know if I can answer the nuances, but I will say this. I am a firm believer, and actually it's, as you guys were looking at my dining room, I really do believe in people having a seat at the table and coming together and have these conversations. And so I do think that there has to be a willingness. I know I've talked about my dad a lot throughout this presentation, but I think that, having grown up in ministry and even kind of acknowledging that everyone has different trainings and is coming, from a different lens, mental health is not always something that has historically been accepted or even seen. Or as people are, exploring their options on who they seek help to. We know that in certain communities are going to clergy first. And so I think the more that we're able to have these conversations, we are willing, we are humble, that's where it starts. It's a relationship. I think I am a better treatment provider because of the teams that I work with and kind of recognizing that we may not always agree on how things should be done, but perhaps I'm going to hear a perspective that I hadn't considered before. So I think the nuances of this conversation that I probably would pass along is that it's not always as clear and as simple, but perhaps just having a posture that is willing to hear and understand as much as we are capable. That's all that most of us ask.
I completely agree. I think sometimes religion can feel so black and white, and eating disorders is definitely not. And so how do we come out of, even when, looking at it from curiosity rather than saying, no, this is the rule, move on. But, so I think there's different ways that we can also interpret it. And again, I think at the end of the day, it's my relationship with God. And that is the only thing that matters to me is what I want to do with that and how I want to practice that.
I think hearing some of the fact that clergy would love some education around this, I think is where I'd like to really focus a lot. And I think really just sort of coming home to the fact that in just so many, not just religion, but so many other communities, eating disorders are so misunderstood, and really not seen as challenging mental health disorders, right? It almost seems like people treat them as a choice. And I think the common thing that unites all of us around this is food. Mm-hmm. And, food and religion is really important. And there's a lot of meaning to food. There's a lot of meaning to eating, not eating certain types of foods. There's traditions involved. And even when there's not religion involved, food is what connects all of us. And I think, thinking about how food can be challenging for some folks and what that looks like, what that sort of, how deep that can go for the individual is something that I think I would love for more people to understand, because I think it's that entry point, right, that allows people to understand, I'm my way of thinking about food might not be really my advice right here might not be helpful. Yeah. Right? I need to really think about, there's some learning I need to do in this respect, right? To really help my loved one, my congregant, my friend, my partner, my dad, my mom, all of those things. And I think that's where I'd love to see some like deeper discussions.
Aaron, I seriously, that's so good. So good. And as soon as you said that, the first thing that came to my mind was, I remember as a kid, we were living in Cyprus at the time, and it was the first time I had ever eaten pork. It was at our neighbor's birthday party, and it was pepperoni pizza, and my sister and I were at the party, and we took a bite, realizing what we had done, because as Muslims, we are not allowed to eat pork. And she and I freaked out. I remember we came downstairs to my mom, we were crying, we were like, what's gonna happen? We had this, what do we do? And my mom was like, you're fine, relax, calm down, go back to the party, just don't eat the pizza. You're gonna live. But it was such a scare, and food it is such a, I love how you, it is. Food is such an integral part in our lives, and it's so important, so.
I think the deeper meaning of that, and probably the position that kind of brings us back to where we started, just religion versus spirituality, like this is a heart posture. And so how do we take things beyond a practice to increase our spiritual connection with our respective higher power? And I think that's so important when we're working with eating disorder clients, or we're connecting with people in the community. Like, let's look deeper and find that meaning, and how do we reduce shame and guilt around this? So I love that we were able to have this conversation, and that people are interested in continuing this. It's so needed.
I feel like some things, I wonder if we end, and I'll see if folks have other questions in the chat, and I've had that there, so folks can share in the time that we have remaining. But I'm wondering for just the four of us to think about some things that stand out, just like authentically and honestly. It could be a word, could be a phrase, could be a feeling that stand out from the conversation. I can start just to give you all time to. I'm hearing like a flexibility with fasting without having shame. I'm hearing like a negotiation between honoring religion and faith and the practices in which we're having with that. And I'm hearing, especially for providers, how to approach conversations with a sense of curiosity and asking probing questions, knowing that something might be here, as some themes that have come up in our discussion. How do other folks feel, think, relate to those?
My three words are nuance, listen, and affirm. And those are the words that I'm taking from today, because I heard them and I wrote them all down as people were saying them, because as I write them down, that's how I internalize stuff. So those are the three words I'm taking.
I would have to say gratuity, grateful that I am, have this opportunity to be here and to share this experience, because I think the Muslim population is, especially in eating disorders, is so underserved and misunderstood as well. And so I feel really blessed and lucky to be able to share this and have these conversations with all of you.
I hate to be that therapist, but I hear in all of these conversations, or even in the comments that I feel like I've gotten privately, or in the chat that you've read, Ari, is there such a desire to kind of balance our lived experiences with perhaps the idea that other people have other lived experiences that are equally as valid. And so there's kind of that push to walk the middle path, holding both of these sides as true.